Every story has its moment. Mine comes at 1,000 subscribers. Subscribe and be here when the story is finally told. At approximately 11:30 a.m. in 1943, during a daylight bombing mission over occupied Europe, a U.S. Army Air Force's B-17 Flying Fortress flew in tight combat box formation under standard doctrine. The crew had completed multiple missions. No deviation was expected. The investigation was opened not on memory or dramatization, but on operational logs, crew statements, and weather reports. The investigation opens with a clear reconstruction of the mission parameters, established through operations logs, crew statements, and weather reports rather than memory or dramatization. It was a daylight bombing mission conducted by the U.S. Army Air Forces in 1943, flown according to standard European theater doctrine. Tight combat box formations, fixed altitudes, fixed airspeeds, and minimal deviation once over occupied territory. The objective itself is treated as secondary in the record. What mattered from the beginning of the inquiry was the formation, its spacing, its rigidity, and the assumptions built into it. The aircraft under review was a B-17 Flying Fortress with a crew that had already completed multiple missions. The pilot was in his mid-20s, trained under accelerated wartime programs, competent but not inexperienced. He had seen aircraft lost to flak and fighters before and understood the narrow margin between discipline and destruction. His co-pilot had fewer hours but had proven steady, particularly during long formations where fatigue and monotony often led to small, dangerous errors. The navigator and bombardier, both stationed in the nose, were specialists, quiet professionals whose work required constant focus under extreme exposure. Their role placed them physically and psychologically at the front of the aircraft, responsible for precision but fully aware that they would be the first to absorb any impact. From the moment enemy fighters penetrated the formation, tension increased in predictable ways. Formation integrity tightened rather than loosened, aircraft closing distances instinctively to maintain overlapping fields of fire. This response, while doctrinally correct, reduced lateral margins to the minimum tolerable distance. Radio traffic increased. Commands were brief, clipped, and incomplete, shaped by training rather than deliberation. No crew expected a collision. Doctrine assumed disciplined pilots and predictable maneuvers, even under attack. The collision itself was sudden and unambiguous. Another aircraft, maneuvering defensively within the formation, crossed into the B-17's path at a closing angle that left no time for correction. There was no warning shout, no gradual realization. The impact tore through the forward section of the aircraft with structural violence rather than explosion. The bombardier and navigator were killed instantly. Their loss registered not as emotion at first, but as absence. No responses on interphone, no movement where there should have been constant activity. Inside the cockpit, the pilot felt the aircraft lurch violently forward and then lighten in a way that made no aerodynamic sense. Control feedback changed immediately. Instruments failed almost at once. Wind and debris flooded the forward compartment. The co-pilot's first instinct was not panic but disbelief. The aircraft was still airborne, which contradicted everything he had been taught about structural loss of that magnitude. Both men understood within seconds that the aircraft was no longer operating within any known performance envelope. The immediate emotional response recorded later was restraint rather than fear. Shock was present, but training suppressed outward reaction. The pilot's concern was not survival in the abstract, but responsibility, keeping the aircraft from becoming an uncontrolled hazard to others in the formation. The co-pilot focused on maintaining any form of stability, aware that aggressive corrections could finish what the collision had started. Neither spoke unnecessarily. Silence was functional. As the aircraft dropped out of formation, other crews observed the damage and assumed loss was inevitable. This assumption would later influence enemy behavior, but at this stage it primarily shaped Allied expectations. The bomber was logged as effectively destroyed, a formality that reflected prevailing experience rather than confirmed outcome. The investigation frames this moment as the starting point, not the climax. The central questions are established but not answered. How formation discipline contributed to collision risk, why no corrective doctrine existed for sudden structural loss, and how immediate human judgment replaced formal procedure. The deaths of the forward crew are documented in precise, unemotional language, emphasizing that the aircraft's continued flight did not alter the cost already paid. The chapter closes with the aircraft alone in hostile airspace, no longer protected by formation doctrine, still airborne, but no longer governed by it. On the surface, radio logs and reports remain calm and procedural. Beneath them lies the unresolved weight of responsibility. An aircraft that should not exist in that condition, a crew making decisions without guidance, and an investigation that has only just begun. The aircraft continued forward without formation reference, no longer anchored by the predictable geometry of the combat box. Airspeed dropped gradually as the pilot eased the throttles back, not as a calculated maneuver, but as a reaction to the way the airframe began to feel unstable under load. The nose was gone, and with it the natural resistance that balanced the aircraft in level flight. The controls responded with a delay that forced both men in the cockpit to stop thinking in terms of procedure and begin responding to pressure, vibration, and sound. The pilot kept his eyes forward, though there was little left to see. Wind tore through the open fuselage, carrying fragments of insulation and loose paper past the cockpit and into the rear of the aircraft. The temperature dropped sharply. Oxygen masks were already in place, but the sudden exposure made breathing feel labored and mechanical. His primary concern was keeping the aircraft from pitching down. The loss of weight at the front had shifted the balance rearward, and any sudden correction risked a stall or structural failure. The co-pilot adjusted trim constantly, small inputs made without comment. He understood that nothing about the aircraft's behavior was predictable anymore. The control cables had not fully failed, but their response was inconsistent. Every movement had to be tested, then repeated with restraint. He avoided looking down toward the open front section, not out of fear, but because it offered no useful information. What mattered was whether the aircraft stayed level for the next few seconds. Behind them, the flight engineer moved forward from his station, stepping carefully around debris. His role shifted instantly from monitoring to improvisation. He checked engine readings by sight rather than instruments, noting vibrations that suggested uneven airflow across the wings. He reduced power incrementally, aware that full output could tear weakened mounts or overstress the airframe. The engines were still running clean, but nothing about the aircraft could be trusted. The remaining crew members responded without orders. Gunners left their positions, abandoning defensive coverage that no longer mattered. They moved toward the center of the aircraft, carrying loose equipment, ammunition boxes, anything that could be repositioned to counterbalance the missing nose. No one discussed weight calculations. They worked by instinct, informed by experience loading aircraft and understanding how small changes affected flight behavior. Each movement was slow, deliberate, and cautious, as if the aircraft might react to haste. Emotion was present, but it stayed contained. The loss of the bombardier and navigator registered fully now, not as shock but as a steady awareness. There was no time to acknowledge it openly. Their absence created both a physical void and a functional one. Navigation instruments were destroyed, maps gone, and the front of the aircraft offered no protection from slipstream or debris. The crew understood that whatever decisions were made from this point forward would rely entirely on judgment rather than planning. The pilot felt the pressure of command more acutely than fear. He knew that bailing out was an option, but also understood what it meant. Parachuting over occupied territory would scatter the crew across hostile ground, likely leading to capture or death. Remaining with the aircraft carried its own risks, but it preserved control. As long as the aircraft responded, even minimally, it remained a shared responsibility rather than an individual gamble. German fighters were still visible at a distance, moving cautiously. Their behavior reinforced the crew's assessment of the situation. The damaged aircraft was being watched, not attacked. The assumption was clear: it would not last. Anti-aircraft fire remained a threat, but sporadic, unfocused. The aircraft's reduced speed and erratic silhouette made it a poor target. The crew did not interpret this as mercy or chance, but as miscalculation. As minutes passed, the aircraft did not break apart. This fact began to influence decision-making. The pilot stabilized altitude at the lowest sustainable level, trading height for control. The co-pilot confirmed that lateral stability could be maintained as long as corrections remained minimal. The flight engineer reported that engine temperatures were holding within tolerable limits. These were not reassurances, but data points, enough to justify continued flight. By the time the aircraft crossed into friendly airspace, no one spoke of relief. The immediate danger of interception had passed, but the problem was far from solved. The aircraft was still fundamentally compromised, flying on borrowed structural integrity. The crew understood that survival up to this point did not imply survivability to landing. What had kept them airborne was not a single decisive action, but a series of restrained choices, each made with the awareness that one mistake would end everything. The aircraft remained in motion, held together by discipline rather than design, moving toward the next phase of the ordeal with no expectation of safety, only the obligation to continue. The aircraft remained visible against the sky longer than expected, its damaged silhouette unmistakable even at distance. German fighters maintained separation rather than closing in, holding position off the bomber's flanks and slightly above. Their behavior suggested evaluation rather than pursuit. The aircraft's speed was low, its profile irregular, and its forward section visibly open. From the outside, it appeared to be in the final stage of loss, still airborne only because it had not yet been overtaken by gravity or structural failure. Inside the aircraft, this pause was noticed but not interpreted as opportunity. The pilot understood that hesitation from the enemy did not indicate safety. It indicated uncertainty, and uncertainty could resolve itself suddenly. He avoided aggressive maneuvering, aware that any attempt to evade could confirm the enemy's doubts and invite a decisive attack. The aircraft's survival depended on remaining uninteresting, a damaged object already assumed to be finished. The co-pilot monitored the fighters through limited rearward visibility, calling out changes in position without urgency. His tone remained flat, controlled, as if reporting routine formation traffic. He had learned early in training that emotional inflection traveled faster than information. The crew took cues from his voice. As long as it stayed level, panic remained contained. Further back, the crew worked quietly to stabilize what could still be influenced. Loose ammunition and equipment were secured against the fuselage frames. One gunner improvised a temporary windbreak using torn insulation and cargo webbing, not to seal the opening, but to reduce internal airflow that threatened to dislodge remaining components. Another checked the tail section for stress fractures, finding none immediately visible, but noting vibration patterns that suggested uneven lift. The absence of navigation capability became more apparent as time passed. With the navigator gone and his instruments destroyed, course correction relied entirely on visual landmarks and general orientation. The pilot recognized familiar features below: river bends, rail lines, terrain patterns, but did not attempt precision. The goal was not accuracy, but direction. West was sufficient. Altitude was adjusted only to maintain control, not to optimize performance. German fighters continued to circle, maintaining distance. Intelligence analysis conducted later would identify this behavior as a pattern. Heavily damaged aircraft were often observed rather than immediately destroyed, particularly if they appeared structurally unstable. Pilots were trained to conserve ammunition and avoid unnecessary risk. A bomber that seemed certain to crash required no intervention. That assumption governed the engagement now, though the crew inside the aircraft had no way of knowing how close the enemy was to reconsidering. Anti-aircraft fire appeared intermittently, scattered and imprecise. The aircraft's altered flight characteristics made it difficult for gunners to lead correctly. Bursts detonated behind and below, close enough to be felt, but not close enough to force evasive action. The pilot held course, refusing to react unless absolutely necessary. Any sudden movement risked structural failure more than enemy fire. The question of bailout was addressed internally without formal discussion. Each crew member understood the implications. Parachuting would mean descent into occupied territory, separation from one another, and immediate exposure to ground forces. Survival odds were minimal. Remaining with the aircraft offered a controlled environment, however compromised, and the possibility, however remote, of reaching friendly lines. The decision was not framed as bravery or defiance. It was a calculation based on geography, probability, and responsibility. As the aircraft continued westward, the distance between it and the German fighters increased gradually. Whether this was intentional disengagement or a simple consequence of fuel conservation was unclear. The crew did not track the fighters once they moved out of immediate range. Attention returned inward to the aircraft itself. Every sound was evaluated. Every vibration was noted. Time stretched, measured not in minutes, but in the space between potential failures. When the aircraft finally crossed into friendly controlled airspace, there was no announcement. No visible marker distinguished one side from the other at altitude. The change was inferred from the absence of enemy presence and the pattern of ground fire, which ceased entirely. The aircraft was still damaged, still vulnerable, but no longer under immediate threat from interception. The problem shifted quietly and without ceremony. Remaining airborne was no longer the primary challenge. Bringing the aircraft down intact now occupied every thought. The crew understood that nothing in their training addressed landing an aircraft, missing its forward structure. Whatever happened next would test not endurance, but restraint and precision under conditions no one had prepared for. The aircraft descended gradually, not because altitude was no longer needed, but because holding it had become increasingly unstable. Power settings were reduced in small increments, each change followed by a pause to observe how the airframe reacted. The pilot avoided steep turns entirely. Even shallow banking caused uneven pressure along the fuselage, producing vibrations that traveled through the control column and into his hands. He learned quickly that the aircraft could still be guided, but only if treated as something fragile rather than mechanical. Radio contact with friendly control was established with difficulty. Transmission quality was poor, affected by damage to wiring and interference from the open fuselage. The pilot reported the aircraft's condition in restrained, technical language, avoiding speculation. He requested a clear landing path and minimal radio traffic. Ground controllers responded with the same discipline, acknowledging the situation without urgency or reassurance. Emergency crews were alerted, but there was no attempt to guide the aircraft with instructions that assumed intact systems. Visibility remained the most immediate problem. With the nose gone, the forward view was distorted by airflow and debris. The pilot relied on peripheral cues and the co-pilot's assistance, using engine sound and airspeed readings to judge descent rather than visual glide indicators. The co-pilot leaned forward slightly, careful not to expose himself to the slipstream, calling out alignment based on runway edges rather than centerline. Neither man spoke more than necessary. Inside the aircraft, the crew prepared for impact without dramatics. Loose items were secured one final time. Positions were adjusted to reduce injury risk. No one discussed evacuation procedures beyond a brief confirmation of exits. The flight engineer shut down non-essential systems to reduce fire risk, watching engine temperatures closely as airflow patterns shifted during descent. The aircraft responded unevenly to throttle changes, forcing constant correction to prevent yaw. The runway came into view later than expected. The pilot maintained a long, shallow approach, resisting the urge to correct perceived undershoot aggressively. He understood that recovering from a steep descent would be impossible with the aircraft's altered balance. Airspeed was kept slightly above stall margin, accepting the increased landing roll that would follow. Brakes were not trusted. The goal was not precision, but continuity, keeping the aircraft flying until the ground took over. The moment of touchdown was abrupt but controlled. The main landing gear absorbed the initial impact unevenly, causing a brief lateral sway. The pilot held the controls steady, allowing the aircraft to settle rather than fighting the movement. The nose section, already absent, removed the risk of forward collapse, but airflow turbulence caused the aircraft to buffet violently as speed decreased. The co-pilot called out remaining runway distance in short intervals. As the aircraft rolled to a stop, engines were cut in sequence. Silence followed, broken only by wind moving through the open fuselage. No one moved immediately. The crew waited, assessing whether structural failure or fire would follow. When none did, the pilot gave the order to disembark. Ground personnel approached cautiously, reacting not to the landing itself, but to the sight of an aircraft that should not have been able to land at all. Medics focused first on the cockpit and then on the interior, confirming injuries and losses. The absence of the forward crew was immediately apparent. Their stations were open to the air, their equipment gone. The aircraft was secured rather than dismantled, a decision made quickly by engineering officers who recognized that what remained could not be explained by routine failure analysis. The crew was escorted away for medical evaluation and preliminary questioning. None of them spoke about success or relief. The aircraft had landed, but the condition in which it arrived demanded explanation. What had occurred was not survivorship in the usual sense. It was an anomaly that required formal reconstruction. By the time the sun dropped lower over the field, the aircraft sat isolated at the edge of the runway, marked and guarded. Engineers began documenting damage patterns. Command staff requested full reports. The flight was over, but its consequences were only beginning to take shape, shifting the focus from survival to scrutiny under the weight of responsibility and loss. The aircraft remained cordoned off through the evening, floodlights positioned to illuminate the damage without altering it. Engineers and ordnance officers moved methodically around the fuselage, documenting stress fractures, rivet deformation, and separation points with cameras and measuring tools. The missing nose section was treated not as destruction, but as a data point. Where metal had torn away cleanly, the failure was mapped. Where it had bent and held, it was marked for closer analysis. The objective was not to explain survival, but to understand why complete structural collapse had not occurred when expected. Inside the hangar offices, the surviving crew were separated for debriefing. Medical checks were conducted quickly, injuries noted but deferred. Each man was asked to describe actions taken from the moment of collision onward. The questioning avoided emotional language. Timelines were emphasized. Power settings, trim adjustments, crew movement, and radio contact were logged in sequence. Discrepancies were noted without comment. The process was familiar to all involved, but the circumstances were not. No one present had encountered an aircraft returned in this condition. Initial assumptions surfaced early. Formation spacing was identified as a probable contributing factor. A preliminary assessment suggested pilot deviation during defensive maneuvering, an explanation consistent with existing doctrine and past incident reports. This line of reasoning carried institutional weight. It placed responsibility at the operational level rather than questioning the doctrine itself. The pilot listened without interruption, recognizing the pattern. He responded with specifics rather than defense, detailing control inputs, airspeed, and the absence of warning before impact. His account did not contradict procedure. It challenged its sufficiency. Engineering findings began to complicate the narrative. Structural diagrams showed that the B-17's forward fuselage absorbed the collision differently than expected due to load distribution and angle of impact. Reinforced sections near the cockpit frame had redirected stress along the remaining structure instead of allowing it to propagate rearward. Reduced airspeed following the collision limited further stress accumulation. These factors were not variables accounted for in training manuals, but they were measurable and repeatable under similar conditions. Attention shifted to formation doctrine itself. Analysts reviewed mission records showing increasingly tight spacing during fighter engagement phases, a trend encouraged by defensive strategy rather than individual choice. Collision risk had been acknowledged in abstract terms, but never quantified against the probability of fighter damage. The assumption had been that disciplined crews could maintain spacing even under attack. The evidence on the hangar floor suggested otherwise. Responsibility widened as the review progressed. Command staff examined training materials and found no guidance for partial structural loss or mass imbalance beyond immediate bailout recommendations. The crew's decision to remain with the aircraft fell outside formal instruction, yet it aligned with operational realities over occupied territory. This discrepancy created discomfort. It implied that survival had depended on judgment rather than doctrine, and that doctrine had not accounted for the full range of conditions crews faced. Throughout the process, the deaths of the bombardier and navigator remained central. Their loss was not treated as collateral or incidental. Reports referenced their positions, their exposure, and the impossibility of survival given the nature of the impact. Their absence shaped every conclusion. The aircraft's return did not mitigate the cost. It underscored it. By the end of the review period, the tone of the investigation had changed. What began as an attempt to assign fault narrowed into a broader examination of systemic limits. No final determinations were issued yet. Findings were still being compiled, cross-checked, and reviewed. The aircraft itself remained under guard, awaiting further inspection. The crew returned to duty status pending reassignment, carrying with them a shared understanding that what they had experienced would influence decisions beyond their own careers. The case had moved beyond anomaly. It had become a test of whether existing assumptions could withstand documented evidence, and whether accountability would stop at individuals or extend to the structures that shape their actions. The investigation concluded without ceremony. No announcement marked its end, and no single document carried its weight alone. Findings were distributed across engineering reports, training memoranda, and revised operational guidance, each written in the restrained language of institutional correction rather than narrative. The aircraft was formally withdrawn from service. Its remaining structure was cataloged, photographed, and then dismantled for material analysis. What could be measured was measured. What could not be replicated was noted and set aside. Engineering conclusions were precise. The aircraft had remained airborne due to a convergence of factors rather than an exception to physical limits. Reduced airspeed following the collision lowered structural stress. Load-bearing elements near the cockpit redistributed force instead of transmitting it aft. Crew movement altered the center of gravity enough to restore marginal controllability. None of these factors alone explain survival. Together, they formed a narrow corridor in which continued flight was possible for a limited time. The corridor was not survivability. It was tolerance. Command findings followed a different path. Formation doctrine was revised to increase spacing during defensive maneuvering phases, accepting a marginal reduction in overlapping fire in exchange for lower collision risk. Training materials were updated to address partial structural loss and mass imbalance, acknowledging that bailout was not always the most viable option over hostile territory. These changes were not framed as reactions to a single incident, but the timing made their origin clear. Responsibility was assigned carefully and without spectacle. No crew member was cited for procedural violation. No disciplinary action followed. Instead, responsibility was absorbed upward into doctrine and planning assumptions that had not kept pace with operational reality. This redistribution did not absolve loss. It contextualized it. The deaths of the bombardier and navigator were recorded in final form, their service histories appended to the case file. Their roles were described accurately, without embellishment. Their positions at the time of impact explained the outcome with sufficient clarity that no speculation remained. The aircraft's return was not allowed to recast their deaths as necessary or meaningful. Official language emphasized that survival of the remainder did not justify the conditions that led to their loss. The surviving crew were reassigned quietly. They did not lecture, testify publicly, or receive formal commendation beyond standard notation. Their experience was folded into training without attribution. In later missions, spacing felt wider. Emergency procedures referenced scenarios that had once been theoretical. Few crews knew why. The case file was closed when all questions had been answered to institutional satisfaction. There were no unresolved discrepancies. The collision was explained. The survival was explained. The loss was documented. What remained was not mystery, but weight, the understanding that disciplined judgment had compensated for gaps in preparation, and that such compensation had limits. Years later, the incident would appear in records as a line item rather than a story. An aircraft damaged beyond expectation. 2 men killed. 7 returned. Doctrine adjusted. The war moved on. The conclusion held not triumph, but balance. Accountability without punishment, correction without celebration, and an outcome measured by what was learned rather than what endured.